A lot of people have been waiting to fly under the benefits of the proposed MOSAIC rule, but that rule may be shelved indefinitely with an executive order President Trump signed a couple of days ago. We'll talk about the new executive order and how it may impact the final MOSAIC rule. If you stay to the end, you'll see that I offer some strategies that the FAA may use to save MOSAIC. My name is Roy Beisswenger, and I've been working on and observing the MOSAIC process for over a decade. Let's get into it. First, some background. MOSAIC stands for Modernization of Special Airworthiness Certification. The proposed regulation is best known for expanding the size of aircraft that sport pilots can fly up to four-place aircraft like Cessna 172s. MOSAIC is a pretty good proposed rule, but it's taken a long time for the FAA to grind it out, and it's still not a finished product. Now, like a soup that sat on the stove too long without stirring, we may never get a taste of MOSAIC. Instead, the proposed rule may be finding itself poured into the toilet and flushed away. Let's talk about why that's a possibility. The immediate reason has to do with the White House executive action that mandates that agencies all have to eliminate 10 regulations for every one that they propose. On the face of it, it makes sense. Regulations have kind of gone crazy. Regulations and insurance costs are the two things that chase people out of aviation the most. Over the decades, the Code of Federal Regulations has mushroomed to over 180,000 pages. Of course, federal regulations affect a lot more than aviation. They cover almost everything that's produced or delivered in our economy. And without a doubt, some agencies have gone out of control. I can't say that the FAA is one of those agencies, but remember that the FAA writes a lot of rules that have nothing to do with pilots. This is important, and we'll come back to it later. But first, let's talk about the executive order. The order itself reads, "The ever-expanding morass of complicated federal regulation imposes massive costs on the lives of millions of Americans, creates a substantial restraint on our economic growth and ability to build and innovate, and hampers our global competitiveness." Despite the magnitude of their impact, these measures are often difficult for the average person or business to understand, as they require synthesizing the collective meaning not just of formal regulations, but also rules, memoranda, administrative orders, guidance documents, policy statements, and interagency agreements that are not subject to the Administrative Procedure Act, further increasing compliance costs and the risk of costs of noncompliance. It is the policy of my administration to significantly reduce the private expenditures required to comply with federal regulations to secure America's economic prosperity and national security and the highest possible quality of life for each citizen. The order requires that, unless prohibited by law, whenever an executive department or agency publicly proposes for notice and comment or otherwise promulgates a new regulation, it shall identify at least 10 existing regulations to be repealed. The White House also issued a fact sheet to go with the executive order. It reads, "Eliminating 10 regulations for each new regulation issued." Today, President Donald J. Trump signed an executive order to unleash prosperity through deregulation. The order requires that whenever an agency promulgates a new rule, regulation, or guidance, it must identify at least 10 existing rules, regulations, or guidance documents to be repealed. The Director of the Office of Management and Budget will ensure standardized measurement and estimation of regulatory costs. It requires that for fiscal year 2025, the total incremental cost of all new regulations, including repealed regulations, be significantly less than zero. Halting the regulatory onslaught. President Trump will halt the job-killing and inflation-driving regulatory blitz of the Biden administration. The Biden administration imposed a historic $1.7 trillion in costs on the American people. Overregulation stops American entrepreneurship, crushes small business, reduces consumer choice, discourages innovation, and infringes on the liberties of American citizens. It also contributes to the high cost of living, including by driving up energy prices. Building on past success, President Trump's first administration undertook the most aggressive and successful regulatory reduction effort in history. In his first term, President Trump asked the agencies to eliminate 2 regulations for each one new regulation issued. Not only was this 2-for-1 goal achieved, the first Trump administration eliminated 5.5 regulations for every new regulation issued. This executive order builds on President Trump's previous success to improve daily lives of the American people by reducing unnecessary, burdensome, and costly federal regulations. So what does all this mean? The obvious answer is that the FAA has to find several regulations to get rid of in order to make room for MOSAIC. The problem is that the FAA really likes their regulations and may not want to let go of a bunch of them. If the FAA won't budge on getting rid of less important regulations, that would mean that MOSAIC may never see the light of day. But as promised, I'm here to help. The FAA has a lot of deadwood and regulations that aren't really even regulations. Some of the deadwood are airworthiness directives, or ADs. Airworthiness directives are considered legally enforceable regulations, specifically defined as such under 14 CFR Part 39. They're issued by the FAA to address unsafe conditions in aircraft engines, propellers, and appliances, meaning compliance with an AD is mandatory for continued airworthiness. ADs are specific to individual makes and models of aircraft and components. They are so common that the FAA prints bi-weekly summaries of all the new ADs they publish. Bi-weekly. In this case, this means every 2 weeks. And a separate bi-weekly document is produced for large aircraft and another for small aircraft. That's a lot of regulations. And over the years, that's quite the accumulation of regulations. But does the FAA ever sunset an AD? It's an honest question. If not, perhaps the FAA could make an effort to do that. Doing so could free up plenty of room for MOSAIC. See, I'm already helping. But I'm not done. Another source of regulations is something I find particularly un-American. It's called Incorporated by Reference, or IBR. For example, practical test standards and airman certification standards now have the force of regulations because they are officially incorporated by reference. But even though they have the force of regulations, they don't go through a normal rulemaking process, meaning the FAA bureaucracy is creating regulations without formally consulting the public. There are 15 practical tests and 15 additional airman certification standards that are incorporated by reference in the regulations. Each one of them is a small book. Perhaps eliminating incorporation by reference could be argued as a reduction in regulations that would make room for something important like MOSAIC. So the FAA could eliminate the regulation, section 61.114, incorporation by reference. It could easily be argued that it would, by extension, be eliminating reams of regulations and making room for MOSAIC. You see, this isn't so tough. But I'm not done. I'm sure there are airport regulations, accounting regulations, grant regulations, and, dare I say, DEI regulations that the FAA could also eliminate to make room for something as important as MOSAIC. I bet you never heard of paragraph 121.570C. That little gem reads, "The Associate Administrator for Diversity and Equal Opportunity shall be responsible for coordinating implementation of this section." That section being 1251.570, compliance procedures. Complaints may be sent to the Office of Diversity and Equal Opportunity, NASA Headquarters, 300 East Street Southwest, Washington, D.C., 20546. I'm suspecting that soon there won't be an Office of Diversity and Equal Opportunity and no associate administrator to head it. All right, that was a cheap shot. But hey, I'm kind of passionate about MOSAIC. Then there is Part 1300, which was set up to loan the airlines federal money after 9/11. Yes, that 9/11, the one that happened in 2001. If the government is still lending airlines money based on an event that happened almost a quarter of a century ago, that is a problem all by itself. So I suspect that there really is hope for MOSAIC. The FAA has to roll up their sleeves a little bit. Maybe they trim the rule of extra stuff like costly noise testing and other items. Perhaps they can argue that MOSAIC replaces a lot of current language in the rule with improved access to aviation. It's all doable, as I've already proposed. And remember, they have bigger brains than a small content creator out here in the wilderness. I'm sure they can make it happen if they want to make it happen. Meanwhile, I have a couple of other MOSAIC videos here if you would like to catch up on what is going on with the proposed regulation. Thanks so much for watching, and blue skies.